Good evening. Welcome to our Bible study tonight. We're going to be looking at the events of the last week in the life of Jesus. I pastored in a small agricultural community, and in that community there were two couples, and both of them had been married for 50 years. They were married within a week of each other. They were in each other's wedding. They did one week, and then the next one the next week. So they were each in each other's wedding. And on their 50th anniversary, they'd never really traveled. Their kids and grandkids saved up for the trip. And I remember getting that call saying, "Hey, we're back from the trip. Come, let me tell you all about it." Well, the wife in one family talked about it this way, and then the husband in another family talked about it this way, and then the guy in the second couple talked about it this way. And I'm like, did y'all even go together anywhere? They told different stories because different events impacted them more. When you listen to all of them and put them together like pieces of the puzzle, you got some sense of what went on. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John tell distinctly different stories about the same event. So, like that, those two couples that went on a trip, they must have taken 400 pictures. And I had to sit and look at every one of them. That was back in the day when you would take rolls of film and you'd take them to the drugstore and you'd get them developed, and then you looked at these prints. And so we sat there for what seemed to be hours looking at every picture from every part of the trip. We're not going to do that tonight because the Gospels are so filled with chapters about that last week. We don't have time to look at those slides. What we want to provide you with is kind of a movie to say, this took place on Sunday, this took place on Monday, this took place on Tuesday. So you'll get some feel for the week and this intentionality of the direction that the week heads in. I want to know who's watching and listening tonight. Kim, do you have anybody tuned in yet?
Ann is tuned in. Brad is tuned in. George is tuned in. Barbara is tuned in.
Great. Who do we have watching from our side, Chris? Is that you?
Yeah, we got Mike Lancaster, we got Pat Walker, we got Margaret Warren, Shirley Evans.
I want to say a special hello to Margaret Warren. I'm her favorite, is what she's told me. So Megan McCullum would beg to disagree with that. So let's take a look at this Holy Week. Thank you all for being here. Palm Sunday is what we celebrated just a few days ago. But the one thing I want you to remember is Palm Sunday is the first day of their week. It's like their Monday. And when you look at Passover being an entire week, this would have been the time when crowds would have been streaming in. Many of them would have stayed home for the Sabbath before they traveled, if they were close enough to do that. And so the crowds would have been immense. So when Jesus comes riding in on a donkey, it would have been incredible. The anticipation of the week, everybody gathered together. I'm trying to think of some comparison. Let's imagine that it's the Super Bowl and it's first Monday trade days in Canton, and it's the Methodist Conference, and it's the inauguration of a president, all wrapped into one big event. That's what Passover week was like. From this community, this nation of about 1.2 to 1.5 million people at the time. Now, I want to give you some geographical sense about how big Israel is. If you were to take Harris County going down toward Galveston, so if you were to start out on the Cypress end and go just west of the Galveston end, that's how big the country is. So when you begin to think that all those people lived in a fairly small place and they come together in this one city for this huge event, it would have been mind-blowing to see this happening. Zechariah 9:9 says, "Your king comes to you gentle and riding on a donkey, the foal of a donkey." We've heard that story. There's one thing that I want to point out. Jesus tells his disciples, "You'll find a donkey tethered to her, her colt with her. Untie her and bring them to me. If anyone asks what you're doing," says, "the master needs them." Or in some translations, the Lord needs them. All through his ministry, Jesus has told people, keep this a secret. Don't tell anyone. This is the messianic secret. Don't tell anybody. It's not time. When he says, you tell them the Lord needs this, is the first time he's ever referred to himself in this way. And so it's hugely significant. We know that Jesus gets on the donkey and he rides into town. Palm Sunday was this impromptu celebration with people ripping palm leaves off the trees, fanning them like Jesus' royalty. We really don't know much more about what happens that Sunday. It would have been a huge day. That procession alone could have taken hours and hours because it's quite a lengthy road and the streets were very narrow, and it would have been an amazing day. Monday is the day that the entire week pivots. It's important that you understand the geography. Jesus is staying in this town, Bethpage, Mary and Martha and Lazarus. If he is not in their home, he is nearby because this was his base of operations. He ate his meals there. He stayed there. So he comes into town, and when he comes into town, he comes through this gate. If he turns to the right, he would have headed toward the political state house. If he turns to the left, he would have headed to the temple. Now remember this, it's all about expectations. The people fully expected that the Messiah would be a political leader. When he went through that gate, they expected for him to take that right turn, to head up the hill toward the state house, to clean things out, to overtake the government, and this was their moment. Imagine their shock and their surprise when he turned to the left. He heads to the temple instead. It's one of those really famous scenes. It's one of those scenes that Christians have kind of a hard time explaining to children. I always love listening to children's teachers in Sunday school talk about this moment. Jesus goes to the temple. He grabs a whip. He begins turning tables over, and he begins to throw the money changers out. Now, let me ask you a question. You can respond to either Kim on my Facebook Live or Chris following through the Cypress United site. I want you to tell me, why was Jesus so upset with the people in the temple and what they were doing? Now, let me describe the temple a little bit as you're turning your answers in, and I want to see if you know. The temple was not like you walked through the front door of this huge building. You came through this outer court area that was an area that everyone could come to, men and women and Jews and Gentiles. There was this big courtyard outside. And then there was an inner wall that only men could walk through. And then another inner wall that only Jewish men could walk through. And it actually said, if you are a Gentile, if you're a foreigner, if you move past this door, you will be put to death. I mean, there were these real strict laws about who could. But in the outside of the temple, it had come to look more like a flea market than it did a temple. And Jesus was extremely upset about that. Kim, do we have any replies yet? Chris, anybody offering an answer?
Susan Nyland said it was the Lord's house. And then Ron said they were buying their offerings.
Both of you are right. Susan Nyland said that it is the Lord's house. And he actually says this. This is my Father's house. This is a house of prayer. This is not a den of thieves. Ron is correct as well. What really had Jesus so upset was they had turned the temple into a chance to make money. Let me tell you how it worked. It was a great con. It was a great scam. You had to bring lambs without blemish to be sacrificed, or dove, or any of the animals to be sacrificed had to be given without blemish. Now, these people would judge these animals and they would point out the smallest little flaw and they would say, your sacrifice is unacceptable. The sacrifice that these people had raised in their house, they knew this little animal by name, they bottle fed it so it could be this perfect little lamb. And they said, but don't worry, we have a lamb that you can buy that's already pre-certified. Now, it happens to be 4 times as expensive as the lamb you could buy in another place. But hey, it's all about supply and demand, right? So Jesus was incredibly frustrated that people had taken this process, which was meant to be intensely spiritual, and had turned it into an opportunity to fleece people. I heard the other day a story about a convenience store that sold a case of water for I'm trying to remember exactly, $37, $38, because they were charging $1.19 for each individual bottle of water. When a store, in a time of crisis like the coronavirus, sells a case, 24 bottles of water for $38, that's exploiting people at a time when they have few or no options. Jesus was incredibly frustrated. He overturned these tables. Now, there are two things that I want to point out. The crowds at that time were still on Jesus' side. It said the children were watching on and they were cheering. The common people were excited because they were tired of being exploited. But the religious leaders said, okay, there's enough of this. This settles it. We are done. We don't care how well he was received. His day has come. He will be put to death. It has to happen this week. These Gospels tell the story differently. It depends on which Gospel you look at. Now, Matthew's purpose in telling the story is to reach a Jewish audience. Megan, would you read that beginning in verse 12? Matthew chapter 21, beginning in verse 12.
Jesus entered the temple courts and drove out all who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money chargers and the benches of those selling doves. It is written, he said to them, "My house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers." The blind and the lame came to him at the temple, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and the teachers of the law saw the wonderful things he did, and the children shouting in the temple courts, "Hosanna to the Son of David," they were indignant. "Do you hear what these children are saying?" they asked him. "Yes," replied Jesus. "Have you ever read, 'From the lips of children and infants, you, Lord, have called forth your praise'?" And he left them and went out of the city to Bethany, where he spent the night.
They come to Jesus and they say, this is wrong. Listen to these cheering. These children are cheering this violent act, this angry act. And Jesus quotes scriptures and said, from the mouths of babes and sucklings come praise for God. Now, one of the things that politicians used to do much more than they do now is they would go into town and they would kiss babies, or they would hold small children, because small children are supposed to be an incredible judge of character. And if the children like being around, I remember when Saddam Hussein was trying to pose for a photo like that during the Iraqi war, and the child looked like he wanted no part of him. It was like this photo opportunity that had been gone completely awry, not at all like the press officials wanted it to. The children applauded him and cheered for him, in part because it was the fulfillment of Scripture, but in part as well as they trusted and they understand and they knew that Jesus was there for the right reasons and he was doing exactly what he should do. Now, two events happen sometime during this Sunday, Monday time frame. We're not exactly sure. At the home of Lazarus, Martha takes this bottle of expensive perfume and pours it over Jesus' feet and uses her hair and washes his feet. A beautiful act that was critiqued, ironically, by Judas, who said this money would really be better spent on the poor. And Jesus said, she's spending her money the right way. She recognizes me for who I am. She knows that I am her Lord, and she is showing me the praise. I think in a way it's Martha's preparation for what she knew would be coming at the end of the week. She understood intuitively what the men in the room missed. In Mark, it tells us that Jesus was invited to the home of Simon the leper. Mark's story is to the common man, to the Gentiles, to the oppressed, to the people who are marginalized. At the home of Simon the leper, there's a man who pours out a very expensive bottle of oil, but it is on Jesus' head. Now, there will be people who say, why did they take the same story and tell it in completely different ways? We have to understand that there was an entire week, and Jesus was the cause célèbre. He was the celebrated cause that week. So he would have been in many places, in many audiences, doing many things. Matthew would have told the story about Martha because it was so important that somebody from the Jewish tradition recognized that he was king. Mark would have told the story about Simon the leper because think about coronavirus. Jesus is the kind of Son of God who hangs out with former lepers. He's the God that he goes and eats with people who have had this mark put on their life. It's going to be interesting to see if people who have had coronavirus have a stigma on them once we are through all of this. We hope that people won't be treated differently, that there won't be any negative association. But Jesus did many events like this, so I don't see those stories as conflicting, people telling the same story in different ways. I see them being completely different stories. Matthew remembering the Martha story because that's important to his narrative. Mark remembering the Simon the leper story because that's important to his narrative. Now, there's one story that's really important. On his way into Jerusalem, Jesus sees a fig tree. He is hungry. He knows what time of year it is. He sees this fig tree with all of these leaves. And at that time of year, the fig tree should have had fruit on it. They may not be bearing fruit right now in Houston, but in the Middle East, they should have been bearing fruit. The fig tree had no fruit on it. Jesus withers, he curses the fig tree and says, you were put here to produce fruit. If you can't be able to produce fruit, you do not need to exist. Let me ask you, does this seem unusually cruel of Jesus? I've heard people say, why is he going to make a fig tree an example? If it was an example, what do you think? Now I'm asking Chris and Kim, our different audiences, I'm asking you, what do you think Jesus was trying to teach us in making that fig tree to wither? As you get ready to answer that, I want to talk about Tuesday morning. On his way coming in from Bethpage, he would have gone down that same road and they walked past that same fig tree. That fig tree that was so alive and gave the appearance of doing what it should do on Monday, by the time that Jesus got there on Tuesday, it was completely withered away. Do any of you know why Jesus used that fig tree as an object lesson? Chris, do we have any answers? Kim, anybody giving us a reply? Megan, can you read verses 18 through 20 in that Matthew passage for us?
Early in the morning, as Jesus was on his way back to the city, he was hungry. Seeing a fig tree by the road, he went up to it, but found nothing on it except leaves. Then he said to it, "May you never bear fruit again." Immediately the tree withered. When the disciples saw this, they were amazed. "How did the fig tree wither so quickly?" they asked.
This is one point where the Gospels tell it a little bit differently. Matthew tells it like it happened instantaneously. Others tell it like it was more progressive, or maybe it was just that they, walking past it a second time, it became this visual reminder of Jesus withering this. One of my favorite quotes is this quote: if two people are exactly the same in every way, the way they think, the way they act, the way they believe, if two people are exactly the same in every way, one of them is completely unnecessary. I like that quote because in teaching students, I try to tell them, yeah, you're different. You have different beliefs or you have different goals, but that's okay. You are made to be different. You are made to be unique. I have understood from scientists that there is no snowflake that is exactly alike, no fingerprint that is exactly alike. In the same way, there should be no individual that is exactly alike. The lesson that Jesus is trying to teach them is, you were created for a purpose. You may look like a fig tree, you may be green like a fruit tree, but fruit trees were made to create and bear fruit. If you can't do what you were created to do, then you are unnecessary. You are taking up space. You are taking up oxygen. You are in the way. Now remember, Jesus was the Lord of all creation, and he had started this process into effect by which that fig tree was birthed anyway. And it was Jesus' lesson to the disciples. I have breathed life into you so that you can bear fruit. Not so that you think or act like everyone else, not that you pretend to be this little spiritual statue or idol. I've created you to bear fruit. And I think if he could have expounded on that, he would have said, Matthew, you can reach people that other disciples are not going to be able to reach because your audience is different and you're going to use it in a unique and different way. Jesus didn't create every church to produce fruit the same way, every person to produce fruit the same way, but he created us to produce fruit. Now on Tuesday, Jesus goes to the Mount of Olives, and this is mostly a conversation that he has with his disciples. It's not the big crowds. The Mount of Olives, it's hard to describe this. The temple is here. There's this little valley that goes down, and then the Mount of Olives goes up a hill. It's a beautiful vantage point to see the temple. Here's Jesus in verse 23 of Matthew 21. Then he was back in the temple teaching. The high priest and the leaders of the people came up and demanded, show us your credentials. Who authorized you to teach here? Now remember, all of the people had welcomed him into the city as the Messiah, the Lord of Lords, and the King of Kings. Now they're asking for his credentials. Do you have your seminary diploma on the wall? Do you have your preacher card? Do you have your license? Do you have your ordination papers? Jesus responded, let me first ask you a question. You answer my question and I'll answer yours. About the baptism of John, who authorized it, heaven or humans? They were on the spot and knew it. They pulled back into a huddle and whispered. If we say heaven, he'll ask us why we didn't believe him. If he says human, we're up against it because people believe they hold up John as a prophet. What Jesus was saying to them is, okay, if you want to put me to the test, let's take a vote. You ask all of these people who have seen me heal the blind and make the dead walk and feed 5,000 people. They've all seen this. You ask them what my credentials are. I've gathered a crowd. They've come to hear me teach. I'll let my life and my example tell you who I am. He then goes on to this Mount of Olives where he talks about the temple. One of the most fascinating teachings of this week is he says, this temple will be destroyed in 3 days. But don't worry, it will be built quickly, rebuilt. Now, when you think about the temple, it's like a lot of ancient buildings. Massive, impressive, huge. It wasn't built overnight. You can construct a modern church building fairly quickly. I remember going to a Catholic cathedral in Romania that had been built in the 1200s and it had taken 120 years to complete. Pastor Tony, they went through 7 ministers through the same building program. Can you imagine? The temple would have been that same way. All of these courts didn't happen overnight. This temple would have built over decades and centuries and added on to. The idea that that temple would be laid low, destroyed, and that could be rebuilt in 3 days was absolutely ridiculous. His disciples were commenting on the temple. Isn't it impressive? It's almost like they're saying, yay, we're going to get to set up our new offices here. This is going to be our church building. This is where we're going to set up our kingdom. Wow, look at me. I've moved to First Methodist downtown, right on the corner with the big steeple. I want the office on the corner. Jesus is saying that's just a building. It's temporary. But what he's really making reference to, the 3 days that the temple will be destroyed, he's talking about the temple of his own body. And he's talking about his own resurrection. He's saying your future cannot be based on building or edifices or religious wealth or I'm trying to think of the word. Things that the church acquires. It's based on me. It's based on God. It's based on faith in me. That's what your movement. And when you think about the early church was basically a house church movement for the first 200 years. It wasn't until 200 years in Antioch where the first church, called the Church of Peter, was built and named for Peter the disciple, and it took 2 centuries. Jesus didn't want his movement to be about monuments and buildings. He wanted it to be about people and relationships and faith. It's really been interesting in the last few weeks for the church to begin to redefine itself, to discover that we can actually be church outside of a building, that it really is about relationships, and it really is about who we are in Christ. I look forward to the day when we will regather in places just like this, in the MAC and in the sanctuary. But Jesus is trying to communicate to his disciples, this is more than just brick or mortar. This is more than us acquiring the First Methodist Church on the corner downtown with the big steeple. This isn't about prestige. This is about faith and commitment. Jesus spent that, what's called the Olivet Discourse, most of the day talking about prophecies that were going to come, about Jewish cities that were going to be judged because they did not receive the gospel well, about those that would be raised. He talks a lot about Matthew 25, the separation of the sheep and goats, how at the end of time, all the nations, the people of God, will come together and they'll be separated like sheep and goats. One of the favorite things I ever did for a children's sermon is I brought in a sheep, a live sheep, and I brought in a goat. And so we had a bandana on a kid, and then we pulled the bandana off and we'd say, okay, which one is the sheep? And the kid would go, okay, that one. And we had the sheep and goat wearing different hats. And we'd switch the hats. And I'd go, okay, now can you guess the sheep? If you've ever seen a sheep and a goat right next to each other, it's not hard to figure out which one is which. What Jesus is saying at the end time when God is judging all of humanity, it's not going to be hard for him to separate the true believers from the non-believers. That would have been on Tuesday. On Wednesday, it is a day of rest. We have very few scriptures that mention Wednesday at all. I think it was a time for Jesus to rest after a very demanding trip to Jerusalem. It was a demanding first few days, a lot of conflict with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Jesus is using this not only as a chance to rest up before the Last Supper, when he's going to give his disciples those last instructions. He knew that he was going to have to prepare for a trial, and he knew that he was going to have to prepare for crucifixion. So Jesus uses Wednesday as a day of rest. So let's recap. Sunday, Palm Sunday, the great entrance. Monday, the temple the tables being overturned. Jesus saying this is a house of prayer, reestablishing that. Tuesday are the prophecies about all of these things that are going to happen and how everything's going to settle out. Wednesday is a day of rest, which brings us to Thursday. Thursday is Maundy Thursday. It is what we will observe tomorrow. We know that it was in an upper room, so it would have had to have been a nicer home. Now, most houses back then had a roof that people would go up on, but not all houses had a second story or this upper room. It would have to have been a significantly large room, because if it were just Jesus and his disciples, it would have taken a lot of room. But if there had been other family members there as well, it would have really needed to be extensive. You remember the famous painting of Jesus and his disciples? Take that picture and get it out of your mind. It wouldn't have looked that way at all. They would have been seated in tables either arranged like a U shape or arranged like a rectangle, and they would have been seated around that facing in. The conversations would have been occurring. It would have been a very intimate meal. Here is where Jesus celebrates Passover with his disciples. If you go back and read the Gospels, you will understand that Jesus made going to the Passover in Jerusalem a habit. He didn't go there just every now and then. He went there all the time. We read about Jesus at the age of 12 going to the Passover and to the temple. We read about times in his ministry when those ministry tips wouldn't be interrupted. Not interrupted, but purposefully interrupted, like by things of the festival of the tabernacles or the Passover celebration. Jesus was very careful to observe all of these. And he observes the Passover, but he makes it uniquely his by talking about the blood, the wine that represents his blood that will be shed, and his body that would be broken. He gives the Passover unique connotation and understanding. If you knew, I'm going to ask a question again for Kim and Chris and the people watching. If you knew you only had one day left, how would you spend that day? Who would you talk to? How would you spend your time? How would you invest that time? Jesus chose his time carefully. They would have left, they would have sung a hymn at the upper room, and then they would have been dismissed. It would have been dark. So as they head back toward Bethpage, Jesus goes back to the Garden of Gethsemane and asks his his three most trusted disciples, Peter, James, and John, would you sit here? I'm going to walk a little ways away, and I'm going to pray. Jesus chose at this crucial point in his life to pick the people that he trusted the most. If you only had one day to live, where would you spend that time? Who would you spend it with? Kim, do we have any responses? Chris?
Ron said, with my kids praying. Carol said, loving on my family. And Susan said, with loved ones.
Yeah, if you knew for sure you only had a day left, you would spend that time with family. I remember when I was first a pastor in Groom, Texas, going to, Tony, what was the name of the Catholic hospital up there? There was the Baptist one out on the edge of town. There was I'll think of it. There was a hospital there that had a hospice unit associated with it. The nuns were so great. They ran it so well. And I remember staying up with the Babcock family all night because the doctor had said, he's only got today. And you wanted as a family to be there. That was the most important place. Now, here's what happens. Jesus tells his disciples, I'm going to pray. I'm going to ask you to do one thing. Stay awake and pray with me. After an hour, he comes back and they had fallen asleep. He said, please pray for me. He goes and he prays. He comes back and they still couldn't stay awake. It's during all of this that Judas gathers what is known as this band of ruffians. Some scriptures have translated this mob of some religious leaders and some people who are just out. It's almost like bounty hunters. Judas comes up and kisses Jesus on the cheek. That is the symbol that Judas is identifying Jesus. He is the one. Because it was important, because in the darkness of that garden, they had to make sure that they arrested the correct person. Over Thursday night into Friday morning, there are a series of trials. The first trial is religious, and Jesus is condemned as a heretic. But that is not enough to put him to death by Roman law. So they send him to the Roman court, who washes his hand of the event to send it back to the Jewish court, who still says we've got to make this happen, and sends it back to the Roman court, who finally says he will be crucified. Now, there's a deadline looming. Friday at sundown, Jesus has to be dead. So these people realize that they are working on a timeline. It has to happen, and it has to happen quickly. Two things happen very quickly that are very important. The trials do not do things in a normal way. It is just rigged in every way that a trial can be rigged, and the results are a death penalty. Secondly, Jesus would be scourged. He would be beaten with whips, and it would have been cruel beyond imagination. If you ever saw The Passion of the Christ with Mel Gibson, it was painful for me to watch, but it was actually a fairly accurate description of what would have taken place. They did that to hurry up the death process on the cross. Kim, what time do we have? I want to know how much time I've got left. Okay, got about 4 minutes left? 6:35, okay. I'm going to wrap up with this last illustration. We study the Salem witch trials in our English class. We study The Crucible by Arthur Miller. There's a poem that we read before we get into the witch trials. There is a lady named Mary. She is hung for being a witch. They leave her on the gallows all night. They come back, and when they pull her off the rope, she is still alive. Now, the poem makes the point that the next 13 years of her life are really awful because the only person who can survive a hanging is a witch. And so even though we know she's not a witch, the people in the town didn't know that. So the only thing worse than surviving a hanging is living for the next 13 years while people think you're a witch. Sometimes crucifixions took days. They didn't have that comfort. They didn't have that timeline. So Jesus had to die. Jesus died. The crucifixion begins in the 9th hour, which would have been 9 o'clock. It goes for 6 hours. Finally, about the 3rd hour, which would have been our 3 o'clock, Jesus would have died. Now, that's important because they have to get him buried before sundown, before the Sabbath starts. So all of this is taking very quickly, and it's all very intentional on meeting that timeline, because how can we go to church if we haven't killed somebody the correct way? It's all scandalous, and it's devious, and it is evil personified. So let's review very quickly. Sunday is Palm Sunday, the grand entrance. Monday is Jesus coming into the temple and overturning the tables. Tuesday is Jesus teaching his disciples in the Mount of Olives what's going to happen, these great prophetic. Wednesday is him teaching his disciples, probably back at Bethpage, where he's able to rest up. Thursday is Maundy Thursday, when the Passover event. Thursday night, Friday morning, the trials. Friday morning early, he would have been scourged. He would have been put on the cross at 9. He would have been dead by 3. He would have been buried before the sun went down. Friday night, Saturday night, all we know is that the disciples hid because they were afraid they would be next. Jesus stays in the ground for parts of 3 days. That's very important. By Jewish law, you had to be dead 3 days to be considered legally dead. Friday would have been 1 day. Saturday, the Sabbath, would have been the second day. And Sunday morning would have been part of the 3rd day. By Jewish law, he had met all the requirements of being legally dead. That's why 3 days in this are incredibly important. As you think about Maundy Thursday, tomorrow, and Friday, I hope knowing the events of the week and the order in which they happen helps you have some sense of seeing how crowded this week was and how quickly it moved from Jesus being praised on Sunday in Palm celebration to end up on a cross, scandalized on Friday. But he was resurrected on Sunday. I call this 8 days that changed the world. We really need to find some ways to spend more time talking about this week other than Holy Week. So much happens. The teaching is so rich. But maybe this overview will help you understand what happened on Holy Week. Our prayers go out to you and your family. I hope that you stay healthy and stay safe. Tomorrow night at 7 o'clock through the Cypress United Methodist site, there will be a Maundy Thursday celebration. We're encouraging you to get the elements of grape juice and bread so you can share communion. Pastor Tony is going to lead you through that process. On Friday night at 7, we're going to celebrate the service of darkness. You can find that through the Cypress United Methodist website. And then on Easter Sunday morning, we'll come back together as a church at 10 o'clock a.m. to celebrate as well. God bless you all. I want to remind you one thing that Jesus said. The church is not about a building. It's not about stones that had been put on top of each other for centuries. It's not about how big your steeple is or about how wealthy your congregation is or how big your church facilities are. It's about how big our hearts are. Being a part of the body of Christ is believing in God and loving one another. Let's continue to remember that message in the next few weeks as we get through this crisis together. God bless you. Let me close this in a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the way you lived, the way you loved, and the way you died. In your name we pray. Amen. Thank you.